Welcome to the New America Foundation. I'm Mark Schmidt. I'm the editor of the American Prospect magazine and some kind of fellow here as well. I used to be here fully, and very glad you all could come to this discussion of what is clearly one of the most important books to come out this year about politics and economics, which is Winner Take All Politics by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pierson. Jacob was one of the original fellows at the New America Foundation, and is the Stanley B. Resor Professor of Political Science at Yale. His collaborator, Paul Pierson, is the John Gross Professor of Political Science at the University of California at Berkeley. They wrote one of my favorite books a couple years ago called Off Center, which I think is one of the best diagnoses of the political culture of the middle of the decade, and this book captures a great deal about the role of inequality in the political culture at the end of the decade, and we'll let them say a few remarks about the book. I do want to say I was struck by, I got the publicity notice about the book, not the one from New America, and it had a number of quotes about it. One of them was from my former colleague and now at the Washington Post, Ezra Klein, which said, "I just read this book in my lunch break, and it was really terrific." And so I'll say a couple of things about this. You cannot actually read this book on a lunch break. Maybe they give you a longer break at the Washington Post than we used to give at the American Prospect. However, the time you read it will feel like a lunch break, as it is a incredibly engaging story and does something that very little political science succeeds in doing, which is to tell a really, really important story in a way that's really relevant, and it helps you understand the world and potentially do something about it. So I'll let them talk about the book a little bit. I'll make a couple of comments, and then we will open it up to questions, and we won't necessarily run all the way until 1:45, although if we do, that's all right too. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Well, I'm very pleased to be here. As Mark said, I have a long-standing relationship with the New America Foundation, and I am particularly grateful that they've been kind enough to have us here for the launch, for the Washington launch. Tomorrow we're going to do a New York launch, so if you don't get enough, I guess you could always find your way up there tomorrow evening at Demos, and it's really. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to just thank Stephanie Gunter in particular for putting this together, Mike Lind as well for suggesting the idea of doing the launch here, and of course Mark for coming in and agreeing to comment on the book at this launch event. I also believe that Tim Noah is here. I haven't seen him, but he just wrote a really interesting series on inequality for Slate magazine, and I think it's really a measure of the extent to which right now, at this time of discussion as the midterm elections approach, that we're really ready as a nation to have a calm, rational discussion about the issue of economic inequality and what we should do about it. And I think it's at least we're at the point now where there's a widespread acknowledgement of the reality that economic inequality has been, in President Bush's words, real and rising for 25 years, actually a bit longer than that. But we're still, I think, at least a large part of the political class is still, I think, in a state of denial about key aspects of that reality. Back in 2006, then Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson said, "Rising inequality is, quote, simply an economic reality, and it is neither fair nor useful to blame any political party." Now, I think we all know that Paulson was probably being a little bit overly dismissive, because it was pretty clear that at that time it was the Republican Party that was being blamed, and that was why he thought it was quite unfair and useless to have that discussion. But I think that Paulson has actually put his finger on a pretty strong consensus at the time, and continuing despite some really important work by Paul Krugman and others, and Tim Noah in his recent series, that really dismisses the view that politics and public policy could play a big role in the run-up in inequality. Certainly those who have been on the winning end of rising inequality, those at the very, very top, have been quick often to suggest that their gains have very little to do with government or politics. The former head of Citigroup, Sandy Weil, said to the New York Times in a series that on the New Gilded Age that people can look at the last 25 years and say this is an incredibly unique period of time. We didn't rely on somebody else to build what we built. It's a telling statement, given that, as some of you probably know, and as we discuss in the book, Weil actually displays a trophy of sorts in his office. It's sort of the banking equivalent of a stuffed lion's head. This actually isn't in the book, and I wish I had known about it when we were writing it. But just the other day, I discovered that mounted on the wall of his Citigroup office is a hunk of wood at least 4 feet wide that's etched with his portrait and the words, quote, "the shatterer of Glass-Steagall." A little play on words. And of course, Glass-Steagall was the Depression-era law that prevented the formation of commercial investment banking behemoths of the sort that Citigroup was, and allowed not just the formation of Citigroup, but of course Weil's net worth to skyrocket into the stratosphere. Now, I don't actually want us to focus here on how some people as smart as Paulson or Weil could get things so wrong, because this book is not about the cluelessness of those at the top. It's really about the deeper story of what's happened to our democracy. It's as we describe it in the book. It's really it's a mystery. It's actually 3 mysteries. A puzzle that's sort of wrapped inside a riddle, and that in turn is wrapped inside a mystery. The puzzle is why we've seen the particular pattern of rising inequality the United States has, namely one in which a very large share of the gains of economic growth have gone to the very, very top slices of the income distribution. And I'll say more about that in just a moment. The riddle that flows from that is how, as we argue in the book, government policy played a really crucial role in bringing about this development. We make an argument, and I think we support it strongly, that what our leaders did and deliberately didn't do, how they made markets and remade markets, is a big part of the explanation for this top-heavy inequality. And the great mystery, the one that really that is the focus of the book, and which motivated us to write it, is how could this happen in the nation's oldest the world's oldest continuous democracy? And the answers to the puzzles that we often hear rotate around what voters want or don't want. And as Paul will talk in more length, our answer revolves much more about how the organization of American democracy has transformed over the last generation. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and I'm going to just say a little bit about these 2 first parts of our big mystery, namely the distribution of gains and why we think government has played such a crucial role in it. Now, you've probably been seeing these statistics. If you read Tim Noah's series, you got a litany of them that show that we've really seen a growth in inequality in the United States that is substantially driven by the gains at the very top. And there's lots of ways to look at this. My favorite is to take the statistics that the Congressional Budget Office has put together, which combine not only income tax statistics on the pre-tax incomes of people at different points in the income ladder, but also all government benefits, all federal government benefits, all federal taxes, and the value of employer-provided benefits like health insurance and pensions, and in-kind public benefits like Medicaid. Take that all and look at how different parts of the income distribution have done. And when you do that, as we do in the book, what you find is that somewhere around 35 to 40% of all of the gains of economic growth over in terms of increased income over the 1979 to 2007 period went to the richest 1% of the population. Now, we hear these numbers so often that we often don't grasp what that means. So just to repeat, we're talking about almost 40% of all of the income gains in American society for a 40-year period went to the richest 1% of the income distribution, and that was actually greater than the share that went to the bottom 90% of the population over the same period. And that's including government taxes, including government benefits. And that figure alone, I think, really sums up the underlying puzzle. How do you get a distributional change like that? Well, it turns out it's even more specific than that, because when you look within the top 1%, it's really the top of the top 1% that's done really, really well. The top 1/10 of 1% or 1/100th of 1%. And without belaboring those statistics, I'll just say that it's those tiny slices of the top 1%, say the top 1/10 of 1%, where the average income is somewhere in the range of $6 to $7 million a year, where you really see the gains over the last 40 years. So what we say in the book, the way we put this, is that the economy has become winner-take-all. And when you start to look at this transformation, you find immediately that a lot of the simple explanations for this top-heavy inequality aren't going to work. For example, it's not just a story of Republican presidents or even Republican Congresses. After all, over much of this period, the Democrats were in power in Congress. And if you look at the timing of Republican and Democratic administrations, the rise of the top 1% is very consistent across this period. And by the same token, what we find is when you look over this long periods of time, that it can't just be that this is a story of the educated. Because we're talking about a very small slice of the educated. Almost all the people in the top 1% probably went to college, but not everyone who went to college ends up in the top 1%. Just to give you a sense of that, if you look at a male entry-level worker with a college degree, they made about $1,000 more in real dollars in 2006 for full-time work in 2006 than in 1980. So over those 26 years, there was a $1,000 increase. So the rise that we've seen at the middle, and there has been some rise at the middle in terms of incomes, is really due to the increased work hours of families, not to increased pay. And if you look at this story of the very top, you also find that the United States looks quite distinctive from other rich democracies, countries that presumably were subject to a lot of the same forces that we are told have led to a rising concentration of income in the United States. So our basic argument is that the pattern of growth, which is so heavily skewed towards the top, is really inconsistent with a story that just emphasizes skills and education. That, of course, doesn't answer the question of what happened. And that's the next part of our puzzle. And rather than seeing this as a natural market development, we really make the case that government policy has played an important role. And I recognize there's a lot of skepticism when one starts to talk about public policies abetting inequality. It reminds me a little bit of those series of jokes you may have heard about about economists and light bulbs. Have you heard any of these? So how many free market economists does it take to screw in a light bulb? None. If the light bulb needed screwing in, it would already have done it. Or how many libertarian economists does it take to screw in a light bulb? The answer is none. If government would just get out of the way, the light bulb would screw itself in. My favorite is how many econometricians does it take to screw in a light bulb? 7, 1 to screw it in, and 6 to hold everything else constant. But the point actually is that there is a common view that that's expressed in these jokes among economists, even economists who recognize this rise in inequality, that there must be some market explanation for it. And we show in the book that, in fact, if you expand your vision a little bit to look at the full range of the ways in which government affects the distribution of income and the well-being of the middle class, that you start to see some really powerful ways in which policy has affected the distribution of well-being in the United States. In other words, government had a huge role, and if you forgive the pun, it was the middle class, not the light bulb, that got screwed in the process. So what are some of the moves we make? Well, one is we say, and I think this is really important, is you don't want to just look at the broad pulling away of the top 20% or 30%. You really have to look within the top 1%. With tax policy, it's very clear that while the top 1% has done pretty well under the U.S. federal tax code over the last 25 years. It's the very small slices of the top 1% have really made out well. Just recently, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities calculated that the top 400 households enjoyed a 45% cut in their federal income taxes just between 1995 and 2007. They went from paying about 30% of income in federal income taxes, to about 16.5%. And that's a pretty big chunk of money. In fact, it works out to a $46 million tax cut for the top 400 filers per household. $46 million per household. And David K. Johnson goes back in his work to the 1960s and finds that the effective tax rate for the top 400 was closer to 42%. So it's gone from 42% to 16.5% over this generation. We also argue that not just that you have to look at the small slices of the top and the policies that affect them, you really have to look at the way that governments shape markets. And an example here that seems obvious after I've mentioned Sandy Weil is deregulation. Deregulation of financial markets, a thoroughly bipartisan affair, had a big effect on the ability of those at the top to make lots more money, and also, it turned out, to shift risks onto us. The top 0.1% is about 60% of people in that verified group are executives and managers and supervisors at companies. About 20% are financial executives. So when we talk about deregulation of financial markets, we're talking about a pretty big chunk of those at the very top. And recently, a couple New York University economists found that the biggest predictor of the pay at the very top, which is way out of scale with similarly educated workers in other parts of the economy, is the degree of deregulation that occurred over the last 30 years in the financial markets. Finally, when we talk about the effect of policy, we tend to only focus on those things that government does. We tend not to pay as much attention to what government fails to do, often deliberately, often at the behest of those who are benefiting from an action. And we see this in industrial relations policy with the failure to respond to a much more aggressive anti-union push on the part of employers. We see this as well in deregulation, which I just mentioned. And perhaps my favorite example of this is when the chair of the SEC, Levitt, wanted to intervene in the 1990s to deal with some of the things that were taking place in financial markets. Phil Gramm, then in Congress, came to him and said, "Unless the waters are crimson with the blood of investors, I don't want you to engage in any regulatory flights of fancy." Well, the waters are crimson with the blood of investors today. And no one would doubt, looking back, that there was very, very strong pressure on the federal government not to effectively regulate financial markets, in large and substantial part because regulating them would interfere with the market activities of people who were doing very well because of their freedom to invent new and exotic and often very risky financial instruments. So the winner-take-all economy was made in substantial part, not entirely, in Washington, and that is itself the great mystery. How could that happen in a country founded on the ideal of political equality? How could a set of policies that seem to do so little for do so little for most Americans and so much for a very small slice of the top, how could those get passed? And it's a difficult question. It's a hard question. It's the question at the heart of the book, and it's a question that I will hand off to my co-author, Paul.
Well, I too want to thank the New America Foundation for having us here today, and all of you for coming to talk about these important questions. I'll try to be relatively brief. I forgive Jacob. I forgive Jacob for many things. I forgive him for leaving this tough question for me, in part because he indulged me in this book with my predilection to include stories from movies that I liked. And when we were working on the section where we were trying to sum up our views about the politics, I said, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid is perfect to talk about what's going on here. Because that is a movie about, for those of you who remember it, a movie about the death of the frontier, the death of the West. And it stars a couple of essentially amateurs, charming amateurs. who make a decent living by preying on the disorganization of the West. And about halfway through the movie, the first half of the movie is played for laughs. The second half of the movie, all of a sudden they're going to rob a train and they realize that they've walked into a trap and they're being chased by a relentless team that no matter what they do to try to shake this team off of their trail, it just keeps coming and keeps coming. And the tagline of the movie is, who are those guys? Why is it we can't get rid of them? Well, it turns out that those guys are a modern organization. That the banks and the railroads were getting tired of the irritations that were coming from the hole-in-the-wall gang. And so they hired a team of specialists, very well-paid specialists, sharpshooters, trackers, writers, I don't know, whatever, to track these guys down. And though eventually the heroes stage a miraculous escape, they realized that there's no place for them left in the West. And when they escape to Bolivia, they learn at the hands of another modern organization, an army, that there's no place for them there either. And in a lot of ways, the political story that we tell in the main section of this book is a version of that story. It's a story that doesn't focus, it talks about elections, it talks about voters, talks about campaigns and candidates, but it sees the big political shift as being a shift in the balance of organization in American society that really begins to take place in the 1970s. The 1970s is a critical decade for our story. Business mobilizes in unprecedented fashion. Labor is declining. Money is becoming a much more important part of American politics. And as all these changes take place, American politics begins to change. Money is something that we often talk about as being important in politics. It's been played a role for a long time. There's the famous line from McKinley's Karl Rove, Mark Hanna, right, in which he says, there are really only two things that matter in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember the second. But there's a more contemporary version that we came across in researching this book. A journalist who followed Rahm Emanuel when he was head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Commission trying to recapture the House, who described campaigning this way. He said, your campaign is in three parts. First part, stage one, is money, money, money. Stage two is money, money, and press. Stage three, money, press, and voters. So if you're keeping score, that's money 6, voters 1. And we chronicle in Winner Take All Politics how money has become a more and more prominent part of politics. The need to get money in order to finance campaigns, in order to run elections successfully, has become more important for both political parties, and that transformation really happens beginning in the 1970s. But money is not the only thing. Organization extends far beyond that, and one of the arguments that we make about politics is that as important as elections are, and they're extremely important, that organized interests are most focused on governance. They care about what Washington does, not just who fills the offices, but what gets delivered in the form of policy. As David Carroll from George Washington University is here today has pointed out in work that we draw on, interest groups are typically intense policy demanders. Right? They want to get things from government, and they're organized to see their way to making those things happen by helping to control the political agenda, by intervening in the formation of regulations, by trying to not just to do things, see government do things that they want government to do, but to discourage government from doing things that they don't want to see done. One striking thing when you look at the role of money in politics is that by overwhelming margins, most money in politics goes towards lobbying and influencing Washington directly rather than into campaigns and elections. Right? The action for the organized interests is in governance. It's in trying to influence policy regardless of who is in power. So having argued that there's what we call an organizational revolution in the 1970s, changes the balance of power in the countryside, we argue that that's changed, essentially it changes the ecology of Washington. Imagine a big ecological shift in which the local species, Republicans and Democrats, have to find some way to adapt to the new environment. And both the parties do. And a substantial amount of the book is devoted to seeing how this big change in the political environment, big shift in the balance of organized power towards those at the top of the income distribution, how that affects the two political parties. And there, the argument, we think, strikes the right tone between a view that says the parties are both the same or it's all the Republicans. Right? We don't take either of those views. Right? The parties are not the same. There are big differences between the parties. They are affected in different ways, and they adapt in different ways to this change in the environment. The changes, as you might expect, the shift in income and organization and power to the top of the income distribution, empowers Republicans and cross-pressures Democrats. So they both play a role, but different roles. And a lot of the book is devoted to exploring how that plays out. I'll just mention one last part of the argument that I think is important and comes back to a theme that Jacob was stressing in his remarks. And that is that for the issues that we're talking about having to do with this dramatic rise in inequality, much that is important in the story is not about what happens in Washington, it's about what doesn't happen in Washington. We live in, and always have in the United States, lived amidst a very dynamic economy and a dynamic society that is changing all the time. And if government doesn't respond to those changes, the policies that are on the books are going to become less and less relevant to the actual workings of society and the economy. That's a lot of the story behind what happened to financial markets and the financial revolution that we're still dealing with the repercussions of today. Some of it had to do with passing new laws, like the repeal of Glass-Steagall. But a lot of it had to do with simply holding government back, not taking action while the economic world was changing. So derivatives, something that nobody was thinking about when they were introducing financial regulations in the 1930s, you simply stop, as Phil Gramm and others quite effectively did, you simply stop the government from updating financial regulations to take these new realities into account. So a lot of the time, if you can just stop government, tie it up in knots, you can achieve your political purposes. And we think that that's a very important part of the story of the last 30 years. And as we're, by all accounts, likely to be entering a new era of gridlock, which is really, I would say, already begun, but certainly is likely to be reinforced this November. It's important to bear that in mind. We have a piece actually coming out in Mark's journal, The American Prospect, in a week or so, I guess, that explores this issue and simply points out that the idea that gridlock and stalemate and paralysis in Washington is neutral, which is a position that a lot of people take. If the two parties can't agree, nothing's going to happen, and that's fine. We just preserve the status quo. That is a deeply misleading interpretation of what it means when government is so tied up in knots, so blocked by a filibuster rule that's become newly prominent in American politics, by vested interests that block any major efforts for reform. That is not a neutral arrangement. And we would argue not an arrangement that is going to be beneficial to the economic concerns of the middle class. The United States, we say in the book, is drifting from one cluster of modern economies and societies, the group of rich, affluent democracies that we were recognizably a member of that club 25 or 30 years ago, towards a different cluster, a cluster of economic oligarchies, where more and more income and power is concentrated within the top 1%. We're looking less and less like countries like Canada or much of Europe, and more like Mexico, Brazil, Russia. We're not there yet, but that's the direction of the drift in the way that economic power and influence is concentrated. We were talking briefly with Michael Lynn before we came in today, and he said very nice things about the book, but he said, it's depressing. But I actually think it's a book that carries some good news, because we've known about what's been happening in income distribution, though we hope we'll bring that information to more people in the book. But the good news in the book is that this drift in the United States, this shift in the distribution of income, is not inevitable. Right? It's the people who have made the kind of the economic arguments to say this is a result of changes in technology, it's a result of globalization. They're the people who are arguing that essentially it's inevitable, and we may be able to, spruce things up around the edges, keep people from falling too far. But basically, this is just the way the economic cookie crumbles. And we are arguing very strongly that that is not the case. The mere fact that I can say that we're drifting from one set of societies, one cluster of societies, towards a different cluster is an indication that there are choices to be made here. And the choices are being made through politics. Now, thinking about how to change those politics, that's an extremely difficult question too. But it is possible to produce a different distribution of economic rewards that would be consistent with a healthy and growing economy. And the key to addressing those issues lies in political reform first, rather than in economic reform.
Well, thank you both. I think I deserve a little bit of an acknowledgement. I'll just make a couple quick remarks, and thank you again. It's obviously an appropriate time to have this discussion, and it's a real illustration, I think, of the way Paul described the way the two parties operate when you have the sort of non-debate, I guess, about extending the Bush tax cuts for those over $250,000 of income, and obviously the determination of the Republican Party to do that, and the enormous jitteriness of Democrats despite all kinds of polling and everything else. And Senator Evan Bayh said, there's a quote the other day where he said something like, "We just have to get all this done, and we'll worry about all that inequality later," basically, which obviously isn't going to happen. I read this book. This book, along with Tim Noah's series in Slate and a couple other things, has been really important to me because I feel like I'm a little bit of a, as Margaret Thatcher would say, a little bit of a wet on the issue of inequality. I've always felt like, economic inequality in and of itself, well, there are times when you can have a lot of gains at the top, but the real concern is how people are doing at the bottom. And if you have a situation like the late 90s and full employment, and you're still going to have the Bill Gates of the world getting very rich, but if the people at the bottom are doing better, that's potentially all right, a sort of very very soft Rawlsianism, I guess. But I think that a number of the things that have been drawn out in recent months really make you think about inequality in different ways. One of those are arguments which are built into this book and really tied to Jacob's previous book, The Great Risk Shift, that inequality brings with it a lot of the risk that winds up being borne by the people at the bottom of the scale. And I think we've had a couple of things that have come out recently really draw out that point that inequality is a warning signal. It's built into the kind of boom and bust cycle and the sort of disasters that we've had over the last couple of years. Robert Reich has written something similar to that. Raghuram Rajan wrote something in the New Republic, which I thought was really, this is not a particularly liberal guy, economist, wrote in the New Republic that he put inequality in terms of by the richest 1% taking so much of the income gains, we kind of gave credit to everybody else as a way of kind of appeasing them, and in that sense created a very risky situation. And then the other dimension of it is the degree to which economic and political inequality are deeply self-reinforcing, so that you really have a circle where you're not in any way making economic choice. These are not economic choices anymore. And obviously, I think this is the definitive statement of how that happened. And I think going back to the 70s and understanding the 1970s is really key. There's really been a little bit of a kind of interest in the 70s that's popped up recently. I think. As people realize things were happening in that period, it really goes to the issue of drift. Things were happening in that period of far greater significance than the active choices when later in the Reagan years. The groundwork was really laid in that period. I think that to me one of the ways that people tend to I've always been involved in the political reform debates, the campaign finance reform, and there's always a tendency to try to look for that nexus between economic and political inequality in actions. Who took money from so-and-so and then introduced the bill that did whatever. And I think that the focus in this book on the concept of drift, or the consequences of stalemate, which is why I encouraged Jacob and Paul to write a piece for us about that topic, really helps you understand that in a different way, that it's not going to be that you'll see the dollar and the action, it's that you'll see essentially the inaction, or you won't see the inaction. And I think people have sort of figured out that politics is a little bit like, I guess chess. I'm not a good enough chess player, but I understand that good chess players can force a lot of stalemates if they choose to, or tic-tac-toe. You can kind of get that if you want to, and if that's in your interest, it's relatively easy to do that. And when you set things up so that the direction of drift is towards far greater inequality, that is really the equivalent of action. It creates the question, obviously, what's kind of left on the table at the end of this talk is really about solutions, and I think that I'd like to sort of maybe in the questions and answers maybe encourage you to think about some of the solutions. And one part of what I take away from it is that there are procedural solutions, and then there are kind of cultural solutions in how we think about the process of governance. So I think changing the Senate filibuster rules is an awesome idea. I used to be a little bit of a wet on that. But I think it's incredibly important. I think campaign finance, changing the way we finance campaigns, is incredibly important. I don't think it has to be as restrictive as people used to hope it could be to overcome some of the consequences of the Citizens United ruling and the amount of money that will come in and so forth. But I think there's a deeper, and how you're going to achieve any of those is a great mystery, especially if we do move into stalemate. But I think there's a deeper question, which really I think goes to the fact that there is a kind of making sure the public understands the consequences of stalemate, or the consequences of the directions that we've moved in. I think there's a tendency to take comfort, especially at a moment where we saw government in a burst of action, and there's obviously an enormous kind of angst about that we're beginning to see emerge, and I think that it's not so much that we want to get rid of the filibuster, we want to get rid of Senate obstruction. Is we want to get to the point where that has a political cost and people understand what's going on out there. So obviously, books aren't the only thing that has to happen to create that understanding. But I think that we're at the beginning, I think, of a really important understanding both of what inequality means in terms of risk and its self-reinforcing nature, and maybe beginning to see how the political process can be a little different. We're not there yet, despite a whole different political arrangement than the one that you chronicled in Off Center. But maybe after this next round of craziness, we can begin to reconstruct that. And I think we'll just take questions from there. The main rules about questions are say who you are and what's your most relevant affiliation, and try to state something that it would be reasonable to have a question mark at the end of it without saying, "What do you think of that?" Whatever. And I sort of vaguely see a hand back there, in the next last row.
Hey, Chris Hayes from The Nation. Halfway through the book, and my overriding feeling is that I'm desperately jealous that I didn't write it. It's really an exceptional piece of work. In terms of the political causes of pre-tax and transfer inequality, I wonder how much an Occam's razor theory of marginal tax rates gets us. I actually think maybe more than we tend to think, which is to say the single biggest policy change is the decline in top marginal tax rates that happens between Carter and Reagan. And once that decline happens, which is so stark, you have the graph in the book. I mean, coming down from 70, 80% down to low 40s, high 30s, around there. All of a sudden, you create a whole bunch of incentives to earn a lot more money. And those incentives then flow downwards through the system. They're incentives to rig the game on the policy playing field to create income gains that are no longer going to be taxed at 70%. And a lot of the things that happen vis-a-vis CEO pay and policy, it seems like you can peg a lot of it just to the difference in the amount of incentive there are for people making lots of money to do everything in their power to get the extra marginal dollar when that extra marginal dollar is actually 60 cents as opposed to 20 cents.
Well, Chris, first of all, thank you. And you're one of the people I would think that could actually write a book like this, so I hope you take on the challenge soon. And also, with regard to your question, I mean, I think you're absolutely right to say that opening up the door to thinking about the ways in which government policy really affects the market distribution of income presses us to look at policies in quite a different way. And this is one good example. Like, what are the incentives that are created, not just for the economy overall, where I think a lot of the attention has been focused? Are top marginal tax cuts really good for the economy or not? But really about individual players, the visibility of their gains, whether they actually report them, how they structure relationships in the market. And what I would say is that, as we note, and in fact, the one figure that I wanted to put that Paul wanted me to put in this book after we had written the book, but he said we need a figure that shows the rise of the top 1/10 of 1%, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the effective tax rate for the top 1/10 of 1%. And notice this is actually the effective, the Piketty and Saez data we use is the effective tax rate, right? So it's after you take into account a lot of this behavior. And the number, I mean, it's almost like a perfect X, right? And I don't think it's certainly not coincidence, but the causal relationship is of three forms. One is, as you say, there is a lot of evidence that CEOs gained enormous amount of ability to extract pay within compensation boards when they could say, look, a big chunk of this is actually going to reward me, right? Whereas in the past, that wasn't nearly as big of a factor because so much of it was being taxed away. And that changed the norms it changed the norms and behavior within these relationships. But there are two other things. One is, I think it's just we tend to forget that that at the very, very top, that these numbers are stunning. So we show we quote Piketty and Saez in the book. They say that the top 1/10 of 1%, I believe it's the top 1/10 of 1%, would have had 7.5% of after-tax income, and if they had kept the same rates as in the 1960s, they would have had 4.5% of after-tax income. And we have similar statistics looking at the Congressional Budget Office numbers. We're talking about like 30 or 40% of the gains at the very top. If you just take a simple zero-sum account, wouldn't be there if the tax rates hadn't changed. So then it really comes down to, and I would say the third thing, to this definition, this question of did these big drops in the top rates, did they spur the economy? Did they create a positive sum effect that overall trickled down, to use the term, to the middle class? And we're pretty skeptical, although it's hard because there are other countries that followed this path as well. And so sort of singling out whether or not the U.S. growth patterns are distinctive from others is due to these policy changes is made more difficult. But what we find that's really striking is that there's not that much evidence that American economic growth over this entire period was remarkably faster than in other rich democracies, which really does lend strength to the view that the distributional effect of this might dominate the overall effect it had on economic growth. And that draws us back to the 2 points you made, that rich are a lot richer because of the drop in these tax rates, and it probably also really helped fuel the rise in executive pay and other kinds of arrangements in the finance world.
Okay. I hate to do this. I promise that we won't give double lengthy answers
Especially when I give that long of an answer.
To every question, but I'm so taken by the thrust of this question that I think there's one other piece that I want to bring out. I feel like in this book we're trying to be bold in getting people to rethink some of the really core assumptions that underpin the way we think about American politics and the American economy and how the two work together. On the political side, I tried to bring that out by saying without saying that elections and voters don't matter, we really want to focus on the organized interest side of the story and how that plays through the political parties and into governance, into what the government actually does, and connect elections and voting to that. On the economic side, and this is really in the spirit of Chris's question, we want to push people to think in a much, I think, deeper way about the connections between policy and the economy, right? That it's not just the way that I think a lot of economists have approached it, where they sort of say, well, there are markets out there that are sort of states of nature, and they produce some distribution of rewards, and then government comes in to do taxes and transfers after that. The government does all sorts of rulemaking and creates all sorts of incentives that shape the structure of markets in really deep ways, right? And so this conversation about what happens if all of a sudden you really steeply cut the taxes that CEOs are going to pay, how does that affect other parts of the system? That's one really good example. Another really good example on the other side is what happens when labor unions are only 8% of the private sector workforce rather than 30% of the private sector workforce. It is not just that a unionized firm pays higher wages than a non-unionized firm, which is the way that economists typically think about it. It is that the whole political economy, the whole system of governance, and the responsiveness of politicians and policymakers is going to be different when you have really big, powerful organizations that are representing ordinary workers, and we've lost that.
Thanks. If I can worsen the crime by just saying one thing to Chris, which is that one thing about that Occam's razor explanation about marginal taxes is nobody actually did pay 70% marginal rates, and that's so there was a different relationship between politics and taxation at that time, where government created lots of little deals and lots of economic activity took the form of tax avoidance, and where now we have a couple big things that take the form of tax avoidance, like the carried interest loophole. And I think things about corporate governance, changes in corporate governance, that moment in 1979 when Jack Welch says the purpose of corporation is just to deliver gains to shareholders in the short term, and that's I think a very significant change. That change in the conception of the corporation should probably be worked into these things. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Norman Birnbaum, also from the nation. We're glad to have an audience.
Here, take the microphone, Professor Birnbaum.
Okay, I'm Norman Birnbaum, also from the nation. And my question is something of a pious footnote to Mark Schmidt's injunction for a broader discussion of these issues. One of the predecessors of Professor Pierson at Berkeley was somebody called Brady, who once wrote a book called Business as a System of Power. So that there are cycles of discussions of equality in American consciousness in what you could call the public mind. And I'd be interested to know what our two authors think of rather than an immediate discussion of the issues, of simply the possibilities of an intellectual breakthrough such that these issues came back on the public agenda in a very, very large way, not alone with academic involvement, but with discussions in the better segments, at least, of the press and the media, and above all, in the absence of big unions, the churches, which are also bearers of social consciousness. But particularly, it would involve certain changes in considerable segments of the academy, not alone those dominated by market thinking, but of certain kinds of conventional approaches in politics and indeed modern history.
Well, it's a fair comment. We try to couldn't do everything in this book. One of the things that I think we're trying to do energetically is to say, if we're trying to understand the moment where we're in now, we need at least a 30-year story. We need to understand what changed in the 1970s and how that is filtered through until today, which, for a current events book, is a fairly long historical reach. And we try to then also push a little bit further back in time to talk about what some of the nature of the settlement was that preceded those events of the 1970s and how it produced a broader, what we call broadland, in contrast to Richistan. Not a social democracy, right? It wasn't Sweden, but it was an area in which you had significant income inequality, but most groups' income was growing at roughly the same rate. They weren't getting further apart from each other. And we think there are really interesting parallels between today and the progressive era, and the extent to which government essentially had been captured by powerful interests, and that one of the big pushes for progressive reformers was to try to generate some capacity in government to respond to the kind of challenges that were being thrown up by an increasingly dynamic capitalism. So we try to give it some of that long reach, and I certainly agree with you that a full account would want to pay a lot of attention to the changing in thinking and what guided some of the changing in thinking and rhetoric in the 1970s. We spend a little bit of time talking about that in the book, but not enough, maybe.
Tim Noah, you're going to get a special exemption from the requirement that what you say has to have a reasonable question mark at the end of it.
I'm Tim Noah from Slate, and continuing the trend of questioners, I actually was a summer intern at The Nation in 1979 with Norman's daughter. My question is a fairly prosaic one, which is your book, which is quite wonderful, talks about this change that happened in the 1970s, and you have some amazing data demonstrating the increase in the number of corporate lobbyists through the 1970s and increase in the membership of the Chamber of Commerce. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about specific precipitating events. I mean, we all know the 1960s scared the crap out of corporations, but in what particular things were they reacting to?
Well, I think and I'll let Paul jump in because he is, I think, really the one of the two of us who really zeroed in on this period as the kind of epicenter of these shifts. But I want to say a couple of things that I think will set that up. The first is that, and this is something that both of us had written about previously, is the extent to which the governing pattern of the early 1970s, of the Nixon years, was a continuation of the governing pattern of the 1960s. And the sort of liberal era continues well into the early 1970s, which is why the kind of dominant narrative where 68 is this kind of great break point breaks down when you start to look at what government is actually doing. And the second thing I would say is, and this isn't, I think goes back to Norman's question to some extent, is that I think that a lot of the 1970s development had been missed because of just how little attention there has been on the part of scholars, historians, and political scientists on business and business development, organizational development. We quote extensively David Vogel's wonderful book on business. It was published in the early 1980s, I think. This is Fluctuating Fortunes, in which he describes a lot of the transformations we're talking about as part of a more general he has more of a pendulum story, whereas we think basically the pendulum got pushed one way and didn't go back. But he really sort of zeroed in on a lot of these changes happening in the 1970s. But we don't have a kind of historical political economy or a political science that pays a lot of attention to what was happening in the American political economy during this period. And so I'll let Paul take the story from there about the way business responded. But they were very much responding to this continuing liberal surge that went well into the Nixon presidency.
Well, I think I'll just underscore Jacob's recommendation of David Vogel's book, one of my colleagues at Berkeley. And if you haven't read it, Tim, it really is a wonderful book that is especially good, I think, on this period. And some of the figures that we give on the organizational change come directly from David's book. It hasn't been updated, and the striking thing is he did have this sort of pendulum view, but our view is it tipped, right? I think he sees the main catalyst as having been, I guess, what you could broadly refer to as nativism, right? That it was really the big expansion of the regulatory state that you got under both Democratic and Republican administrations from the mid-'60s to the mid-'70s. So environmental issues, consumer protection, the occupational safety, and one of the things which caught them off guard, they were used to more or less getting their way and not having to deal with such kinds of. It caught them off guard, and they felt a strong need to counter-mobilize in response to that. Now, we quote the famous Lewis Powell memo, which summarizes that viewpoint, right, which basically says flat out, we're in trouble. If we want to get out of trouble, we have to organize in a sustained way across issues. And Vogel points out, I think one of the interesting things about nativism, if you want to call it that, those kinds of policy initiatives, was that they affected not just a particular sector at a time, but really business as a whole. Right? So it actually, in an ironic way, was a catalyst to sort of cross-sectoral business mobilization, the kind that you get from the formation of the Business Roundtable, the vast expansion of the Chamber of Commerce, and so on. The other thing I would say is that I think early on, pushing against unions was not that important a part of the agenda. There was still an attitude that said, well, this is part of the status quo, and we've kind of learned how to live with unions, and we push at the margins, but that's the way things are organized. It wasn't, I think, really until the late 90s. Now, some sort of anti-labor business organizations were actively involved in the formation of the Business Roundtable, but I think it was really the late 1970s when they started to realize that post-war settlement with labor was vulnerable. And the story we tell around the fight over industrial relations reform, which we really see as a critical event in American politics in the Carter administration. And it's an event where nothing happens, right? They filibuster the bill in the Senate. It falls 2 votes short of passage. And so there is no industrial relations reform. But at that point, I think business started to realize that they could act with a lot more impunity towards unions than they had in the past. And so it's not PATCO. It's not even changes in the National Labor Relations Board. It's just growing confidence on the business side that they can be a lot more aggressive and that there won't be any negative ramifications from that.
I reviewed 3 books about the 70s in the current issue of the American Prospect, and the one that if we're giving reading recommendations, is a new book by Jefferson Cowie, who's a historian at Penn State, I think, at Cornell, called "Stayin' Alive," which is about the working class in the 1970s, but really tells a lot of the story of what Paul just talked about in great detail, and also has just some wonderful cultural material. It's an incredibly important book, I think. Mike Lind.
Michael Lind, New America Foundation. Yeah, I want to keep exploring this 70s issue because going in, you see managerial capitalism on the defensive against regulation, against unions, against international competition. And then emerging from all of the smoke, you have the financial industry, right? And the CEOs who have now aligned their interests with Wall Street, even as they're selling off pieces of their corporations. So I just, wonder if it's worth talking about that for a minute. Initially, a lot of this counter-mobilization by business was actually traditional 50s type corporate executives who still saw themselves as part of these vertically integrated giant corporations. And I think just throwing this out there, one thing you could say is that they ended up not inheriting the benefits of their actions. That is, what they wanted was to slightly loosen up restraints on managerial industrial capitalism. And instead, all of the gains went to these people in Wall Street who weren't necessarily the motive force behind these initial reforms. Just I'd be interested in comments from either of you on that.
Well, I'll make a quick observation, which I think that's a more general story, that we don't want to, I think a simple way to read arguments such as ours is that the beneficiaries of these economic changes were always and everywhere the ones that brought them about. And in fact, there was a very nice call-out in a Washington Post op-ed by Steve Pearlstein that followed with a kind of, because he was sort of trying to play both sides on this, saying, well, but we have a conspiratorial view, and that's not at all our view. And I think Paul put it well. It's an evolutionary view. There's a change in the political environment that in turn leads to independent decisions by actors that end up reinforcing those biases. And here, I think that's exactly what happened, right? And I would say we're working on a piece right now about the current current reaction of business, where we're finding a similar development, and it might even be turning on its head in the 1970s. So in the 1970s, you get this kind of pressure to form kind of peak associations and kind of, for want of a better term, like highest common denominator kind of policies that bring together business around a common agenda. We've seen over the last couple of years, right, as business has become much more hostile to Democrats and to the Obama administration, in part because there's individual sectoral interests from energy to insurance companies that are becoming expressed, and in part because there's a real divorce, I think, that we see between those at the very top within capitalist enterprises and capitalism as a whole. The economy as a whole is still suffering a great deal, yet those who are at the top of many of these organizations and corporations are doing pretty well and have been doing pretty well. And in the 70s, I think those changes unleashed a set of developments that did elevate finance, particularly it sort of gained steam over the 80s, but really took off in the 1990s. And those changes, which led to and were one of the precipitating causes of the current economic crisis, right, were by no means all favorable towards the business community as a whole, or small business in particular. And but one thing that they do seem to have been quite favorable toward is those at the very top of the economic ladder. And that is the story of the book, is really understanding how this set of organizational transformations then feeds into a change in politics that in turn helps encourage and reinforce a set of policies that have been quite favorable towards the richest of the rich in the United States.
Yeah, and I really want to underscore this point, because I think we both winced when we were accused of having a conspiratorial view. We think organization matters a lot. It doesn't mean that it was all drawn up on the whiteboard in some room. And like we said, a lot of this happens as you have certain kinds of market processes unfolding, and then government has to choose whether to respond or not. But one way that plays back into a political dynamic is it's not just that drift happens, as you might say, but then government has to decide whether to respond or not. And when there have been changes that turn out to be highly favorable to powerful organized interests, those changes turn out, maybe many of them unanticipated, they turn out to be very, very difficult to reverse. Right? So even when they're hard to defend, as I would say, the high-end tax cuts at the moment are very hard to defend, but they're hard to reverse because they're favorable to powerful interests. Another, I think, really striking example of this is the fact that we are now, 4 years into a Democratic Congress, and the carried interest loophole for many of the absolutely wealthiest Americans continues to exist. I actually think, it probably will at least get scaled back at some point, because they're going to be so hungry for revenue. Though, if Republicans make big enough gains, maybe not even that. But it is really astonishing that a loophole that, one can argue about the details about how it should be handled, but the idea that hedge fund managers are collecting fees, $100 million plus fees for running other people's investments, and then having those fees, much of it subjected to capital gains tax, is a hard proposition to defend. Not what people intended, but it survives because it's a particular kind of drift that favors powerful interests.
Yes, in the middle.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Samuels, and I run all the blogs for CARE 2, but I spent most of my life in network broadcast news. And I'm very curious everything that you say is impressive and hard to disagree with, but where do you put the impact of popular culture and what it does to the difficulty of reversing any of this. You mentioned Patco. I think Ronald Reagan gave the public perception permission to be harsh to labor unions. Even people who, I know a young woman who's a young blogger, she's probably in her 30s, and she said she remembered when she was a little girl and Reagan fired the Patco guys, and she thought, boy, he's strong. And that was when she was a little girl. So we have all of this other than policy area that we have to deal with. Do you guys have any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I think that we could have written a lot more than we do in the book about the role of popular media and the media in general. But our take on this is that a lot of the developments that we're talking about are at the level of organizational changes and are occurring for the most part without a great deal of kind of voter input or appreciation, but that we're no way denying that voters at the same time are a powerful force. And so what we find striking when we start to look at how public opinion is evolves over this period is the remarkable degree of stability in sort of basic public attitudes towards inequality, towards tax policy. And it seems very at odds when you look at the public opinion polls from the content of the discourse during these periods or from the kind of constant desire to sort of associate a big victory, say, for a particular candidate with an affirmation of that candidate's position on very specific policy issues. And I think one part of that you're kind of keying in on is that for most voters, specific stance on public policy issues is not going to be the central matter, and a lot of this has to do with people's identity with a candidate or the image that the candidate has. And money obviously plays a role in the ability to construct those images, but that can be quite distinct from positions on policy issues. But another thing is we find again and again when we look at sort of where the voters are during this period, the extent to which they really become much more unmoored and dependent on these kind of popular media images and messages, rather than on intermediate organizations like labor unions or fraternal or voluntary organizations that once played a really crucial role in providing them with information. So as we put it in the book, that there's a real decline in what we call middle class democracy, which is a sort of more densely populated, more densely organized sort of process where media plays a subsidiary role towards a much more candidate-centered, much more money-driven process where media images are kind of the dominant way in which people learn about politics and policy, or not, as the case may be. So I think that's sort of in keeping with your general impression. But it's only in that absence of those other organizational ties that you can really see the rise of these kind of these more sort of broad-based kind of reactions that don't seem to be deeply informed by a more fine-grained understanding of what policies are actually doing.
I just want to add one quick point on a very reasonable question, which is you can see the same kind of story that Jacob just told about the role of interest groups in middle-class democracy if one looks at the parties, right? Where, again, when it comes to conversation about the American economy and American economic life, Republicans speak with a clear, emphatic voice. Government is the problem. Lower taxes, less regulation. Democrats are cross-pressured in a way that makes it very difficult for them to articulate a clear message about the economy. Even if you look at the polls, the recent polls today, where obviously Democrats are in huge trouble, as we would expect them to be in a context, it's important for people who are going to overanalyze the election after it happens. If you had told me 2 years ago that there will be close to 10% unemployment when the midterms come around, I think I would, without knowing anything more, I would expect huge Republican gains, and we need to remember that. But when you look at what the polls, there's a detailed New York Times CBS poll recently, which did not make it sound like a Tea Party electorate when you dug into it. Now, some of the Tea Party voters are the most mobilized and most energized and most likely to vote. But what it looked like was an electorate that was mostly deeply, deeply disappointed that the job situation was as bad as it was. But that gave the Republicans even lower marks than the Democrats on almost every economic issue, certainly lower on the tax issue, and on financial regulation. Right? So we think opinion matters, but that it has to be put into this broader picture where the way that the parties and the way that interest organizations are playing into politics matters a lot.
Yes, second row.
David Carroll, American University Government Department. Just building on the last thing Paul said about the cross-pressured nature of the Democrats, I think this is really crucial, and I wanted to ask Paul and Jacob how they think, what hope they have in terms of the long term if you have individual Democratic politicians who have their own short-term career interest is in doing things like getting money from hedge funds and preserving the carried interest deduction, and even on structural questions like the labor law issue you mentioned. Labor law reform has been dying in the Senate since the 40s. And so liberal opinion people have finally, as Mark has, evolved on the filibuster question and, and now seen this connection. But I don't think moderate Democratic senators see it as in there, like, well, we need to get rid of the filibuster so we can pass card checks so we can have more Democrats turn out. And, even they're not there. They are really not close to there. They in their own selfish kind of political interests, they think the filibuster enhances their power and also shields them from some liberal proposals that they don't really want to actually support and don't want to openly oppose. So things like Jacob's, healthcare proposal. I think a lot of people hid. But oh, there aren't 60 votes. It's just too bad. What can we do? So given this asymmetry, right, and the cross pressuring that exists, how can you be, hopeful about addressing these trends in the long term? Given that these are the parties, you go to the crisis with the parties you have, right? So.
Well, I'd love to bounce the question right back at you, David, and I apologize. I gave your university affiliation wrong because I'm staying at a hotel surrounded by George Washington University signs. But I think the core answer that we would give to that question is that there has to be the development of organized pressure around economic issues coming from the middle class, broadly understood. That the politicians will not get there by themselves. That we actually, while some of them clearly get it, and many of them fight the good fight, not enough, especially in a system that's designed to make that really difficult for multiple reasons that we all know well, though we'd run through them in the book as well. But to me, that would be priority one, would be because what organizations there are out there on the liberal side are increasingly not around economic issues. Right? They're around environmentalism or forms of cultural liberalism that often appeal to the affluent, but not so much to middle-class America around lunch pail issues. Now, how you bring that about, that would be another book. But I would say that the one ray of hope there is that there is no doubt that the internet is a technology which facilitates the development of connections among similarly situated people who are scattered. Right? And I would say that has got to be, and it is, it made a huge difference in the Obama campaign. Right? It made a huge difference, not by any means the whole story, but it made a huge difference in the capacity of the Obama campaign to more than compete financially with their opponents. Right? They also got a lot of money from Wall Street, right? But they were able to raise a lot of money that way. And I see more than a glimmer of hope there, but maybe not that much more than a glimmer.
You want to?
No, we should probably take a few more questions.
Let's take it. Let's get a few more questions in the fourth row over here, in the red.
Yes, Miriam Gusevich from Catholic University School of Architecture. Wonderful presentation and looking forward to reading your book. I was wondering, as you're talking about this kind of context within which all of these organizational changes are taking place, if you're addressing at all the whole question of the suburbanization of America, because prior to the 70s, most Americans and major political organizations were based in cities with major as centers of democratic power. And what happened in the 70s was the sort of exodus of the middle class, and people really becoming more and more identified as independent and really not identifying themselves with, even if they were working class, as really identifying themselves as not working class. And so I just wondered if you were addressing that as both a spatial and a cultural change in America.
Well, honestly, we don't really address it, and yet it sounds like a very plausible argument that this matters. I mean, one thing we do say is that the Democratic Party really started to lose its ability to articulate a kind of strong sort of lunch pail issues message during the 70s and 80s, and particularly the 80s, in part because it was in this fierce arms race with Republicans who had gotten a decisive edge. We forget. We just wrote a piece for Politico a little while ago in which we looked at the 82 election. And in the 82 election, Reagan was more unpopular than Obama is. The economy was even worse off than it is today. And yet Republicans who were in the minority, but nonetheless were expected to lose a lot of seats, maybe 60, held their losses to 26, and it was widely considered to be a kind of a total Houdini trick that they escaped. And the main reason they escaped, in our view, was that the Republicans were outspending the Democrats 6-1. When you have that kind of imbalance, it really does matter. And I think that, and we talk about the changes in organization that fed into that imbalance, the decline of labor, and the decline of a lot of these affiliated organizations. And we mentioned in passing that the Democrats really were also did not have a strong national party organization. What they had before was these city-based, and we don't talk about this enough, but a kind of machine-based organization. And they did not make that transition. And so when these shifts that you're talking about were taking place, that was an opportunity, I think, but that was not seized. And one of the things that I think really is important for understanding the developments we're talking about is that timing matters a lot in these stories, right? And especially when you're talking about, okay, well, how is this ecosystem that the parties end up in, how is it shaped? These early moves by business in the 1970s in a period of destabilized politics matter a lot for shaping what happens. And I would think that suburbanization might well play into it. It certainly is a big part of the decline of voluntary organizations during this period. So I think it's very interesting. But I haven't actually seen it explored that much in the work of people like Theda Skocpol or Robert Putnam. I'd be interested to see if there's work that could kind of extend that point.
I just want to make one quick, I guess, clarification on this 6-1 spending advantage. It's not that Democrats running for Congress were outspent by Republicans 6-1. Right. It's that the Republican national committees had about 6 times as much money as the Democrats did, which meant that they could channel the money exactly where it was needed. So you basically ended up at the end of the day where there were 25 or 30 Democratic candidates who were really in potentially strong positions to take Republican seats and just had no money whatsoever. So, just ask yourself the counterfactual. What would have happened to Reaganism in 1982 if instead of losing 26 seats, they'd lost 50? An organization and the financial advantage that they gained by the early 1980s had a lot to do with why they lost 26 instead of losing 50. Bob Kuttner collected figures on Senate races in the late 70s and early 80s and found that Republicans won 85% of the races that were within 3 percentage points during that period. That made a huge difference in their ability for them to present themselves as a political wave of the future.
And whatever numbers you find for money in politics in 1982 or the late 70s, multiply them by about 30 to get to today's politics. Yes. And then we'll just do like a couple more quick. Be as brief as possible, and we'll go on.
My name is Kunio Kikuchi, and I'm with Masaoka and Associates. clearly you're not talking about the huge wealth of somebody like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, who are heroes. Perhaps you're talking more like the plundering of, say, Countrywide by Angelo Mozillo, who took away $500 million and never had to return anything. But I was more interested in your statement that the real rich money is in Wall Street, and possibly the wealthiest are the anonymous people, hedge fund managers and so forth. Have you shown more light on those people and what they do with their money? And is your sort of prescription that perhaps there should be regulation on the maximum income that, say, fund managers could take home?
Well, we don't offer any kind of particular policy prescriptions. I mean, I think there are a large number of things you could do. I mean, going back to our earlier argument, I think a lot of it would have to do with getting our politics to be more balanced, and letting the solutions, if you will, flow from that. The other thing is, I just want to be clear, this is not a morality tale about good or bad people at the top. I mean, the question is why our society is. I mean, there are definitely both, and we tell some stories that I think raise really serious questions about the actions of those who've done very well in this economy. But Warren Buffett himself has pointed out that that the tax code has changed in a way where he may be paying a lower tax rate than his secretary. So there is a lot of concern. There are well-off people who are concerned about these trends too. It's not a morality tale. It's really a story about how our society has changed to allow those at the top to be able to reach these very large gains. And part of I think the implication of that is that we would have a society that was no less prosperous, but in which the gains of growth were more broadly distributed if we had a more balanced politics. And it's not, it wouldn't require regulating specifically what people at the top could earn, but making sure that there's representation in the workplace, that the tax code is strong enough to provide a basic framework for economic growth for all citizens, and that everyone has access to sort of a basic framework of economic security as well. Paul, do you want to add on that?
I think we should leave room for more questions.
That'd be great.
Let's get a couple more. I vaguely see a hand back there. Oh, it's Henry Farrell.
Henry Farrell, George Washington University. As you know, I think this is a fabulously important book, but I just want to push back on the question of structures and organization, because basically you provide us with what is pretty much an account about big structures. So you need organizations to get things done in American politics. And then in the last chapter, you kind of shifted around to say, well, we have the choice to try and make things better. But the question is, how much choice do we actually have? And here I'm a little bit skeptical about the idea that Move On is going to save us, just because these kinds of things seem to be pretty great at at raising money for elections. They don't seem to be so good at paying the kinds of focused and long-term attention to policy issues, that is, internet-based organizations, that you suggest is necessary to actually work. So a skeptical or pessimistic account of your story here might be to say, okay, well, we start to try and grow organizations, and maybe 20 years from now things change. Is this too pessimistic, or do you think that things can be done quicker?
Well, I think we'd be loath to try to predict the future. I think we would be the first to acknowledge that the emphasis in the book and the focus in the book is not on solutions. It's really on trying to understand how it is that we got where we are today, how it is that this democracy has drifted towards the kind of models for society that you see in countries like Brazil. That seemed like enough to take on. But I will say, and I guess we think our contribution towards thinking about solutions that obviously a lot of people are going to have to think hard about and work hard about is to try to lay out what we see as a clear diagnosis, right? So that people look for possible solutions in the right places rather than the wrong places. And I think we all know, certainly when you start writing about things like this, if you are reckless enough to actually read the comments that get posted on the blogs and lots of places, and you see lots of comments of the forum that say, "Well, that's an easy question. I know the answer to that. It's X, or Y," with 50 comments, you end up with 30 different one-sentence explanations for what the problem is. Right? I think what we're trying to do is drawing on the work of a lot of other people and hopefully fueling the work of some people, to think clearly through what some of the crucial structures are, how this has happened. So understanding things like drift, understanding where parties and interest groups fit into the kinds of changes that have taken place. How is it that government, which most economists just think is not that important in explaining these things, how can it be that, in fact, government is tremendously important, right, in all sorts of ways that are underappreciated? Understanding those things better will help us develop better political strategies. And I continue to believe that critical to that is going to be organized pressure on behalf of the middle class. I think any solution has got to include that ingredient. And it's going to be up to a lot of people to figure out how to produce that.
I think we're actually going to. Do you want to say the last word? No. I think the clock is told. I thank you all for coming. Please go out there and buy as many copies of the book as you can. And let's thank Jacob and Paul for coming.